recording.
Yeah, I'll turn it.
Cool.
I'm going to be cooking, so I'll turn my video off as well. Hi, Nathan.
Hey, guys.
Mr. Coles.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so tonight I decided to talk about fat, kind of leading on from our protein conversation from last week. I've had a little bit of feedback from the protein one as well. I actually thought it was quite interesting, just kind of the purpose or the way protein is actually utilized within our body versus the way people perceive protein to be is this thing that's almighty just for building muscle and repair. It actually has a lot more roles than we actually when we think about it at the end of the day. So fat, does it make you fat? You know, that's the question. Does it really make you fat? We're going to dive just to the surface level. We're not going to go too deep into it because you kind of need an understanding of basic biology and chemistry in order to understand what is fat. It is technically a chemical compound. It's an organic chemical compound we need to talk about, and it'll make sense in terms of the way fat is utilized within the body, and then we can talk about how fat is actually, when it enters our body as a fuel source, or where we utilize it as a fuel source during our exercise, what happens to it specifically during exercise to give us energy, and why do we do things that are considered fat burning as well. So we'll briefly cover those points. What is fat? It's also known as a lipid, and in more scientific literature, they would refer to it as a lipid. The most common is triglycerides. So 95% of all the fat we consume is triglycerides, and it comes from animals and vegetables, or animal sources and vegetables. And approximately a third of what we consume is fat, just on average. These are average numbers. And there's 9 calories per 1 gram of fat. So it's very energy dense when we compare it to protein, which we discussed last week, where Dave mentioned it's about 5 calories per 1 gram of protein, where it takes about 1 gram, or it takes 1 calorie. So therefore we actually call it 4 calories per gram of protein. And in this case, energy, fat is a lot more energy dense. And that's part of the reason why we actually store around the body, because it's a almost infinite source of fuel for us. I want to kind of go across to what is a triglyceride, kind of what is the actual chemical compound. And if you notice specifically, and this is going to refer to a little bit later on in the slides, is we have oxygen. Oxygen is down here. We also have hydrogen, and we also have carbon. So these are 3 main molecules, and they also have bonds as well. And they have these chains of fatty acids that are attached to it. So one of these is considered one fatty acid. When you combine them together with a glycerol, you get what's called triglyceride. So we refer to it as 3 fatty acids and a glycerol molecule. And our glycerol molecule is a carbohydrate as well, just to let you guys, or it can be used as a form of energy because it's technically a carbohydrate. Why is fat important? It insulates our body for warmth. It's a great source of energy, and climate and activities can actually be a very large determinant of how much fat you're going to have within your diet. So if we look at more like the Nordic nations, or like Scandinavia, also less so the UK, but we're looking more upper UK, so probably more Ireland, and we're looking like Alaska, Canada, Iceland, and Greenland. Their diet is primarily going to be high in fatty foods, or fatty meats. And specifically, why is because A, they need it as warmth to keep the body insulated, so they need to have high levels of fat, and also B, also what's bioavailable around them as well. So farming is not going to be something that's going to be particularly good, but they're going to have access to fatty fish around them. So their diet tends to be quite high fat. And in the colder climates, we tend to burn more fat as a fuel source, or we better utilize fat as a fuel source in colder climates. But in the warmer climates, we actually better utilize the carbohydrates, and that's got to do specific, that's another topic for another day. I won't get into details of that. It also helps with the uptake of fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. So it's essential that we do have these available to be able to help the digestion of these vitamins and be able to utilize it in bodily processes. It helps to control blood sugar levels. So if you ever have a high carbohydrate meal or a high protein meal, if you actually add a little bit of fats to it, it actually brings your blood sugar levels down. It actually slows down the release of carbohydrates and blood glucose, and it slows that peak essentially. So if you ever have a high carb meal, so if you have something as like Wheat Bix with milk, which is just carbs and a bit of protein, adding something maybe like a small handful of nuts can actually reduce that sugar spike that a lot of people do suffer when they have cereal for breakfast or something like that. Also helps with hormone production. So testosterone, estrogen, and cortisol are main characters or main hormones that we're talking about. And the reason why they're actually fat, or they're actually made from fat or triglycerides, is because they have a longer half-life than peptide-based hormones. So we're talking about antidiuretic hormone, like catecholamines, like adrenaline. And those hormones that are more peptide-based or protein-based tend to be shorter acting as well. Whilst we look at more so the fat-based hormones, they're actually going to be in the bloodstream, or they're going to be have a longer effectiveness on the body. So they're more focused on the long-term function of the body, or long-term signaling of the body. So testosterone, we know it's important for growth and development, and puberty is a long period of time as well. So it's important to make sure that it's actually we've got enough fat in the diet in order to support testosterone production for the individual. And it's almost an infinite source of energy. So fat is stored in the liver, muscles, and adipose tissue. And adipose tissue is our main storage site. It is quite interesting that the type of physical activity can actually determine where you actually store your fat as well. So if you've got like a sprinter, their fat stores is going to be more so in the adipose tissue, because their actual muscle fibers rely more heavily on carbohydrates, because their sport is very intermittent in nature and their training tends to be quite intermittent. So it's very high intensity. So their fat storage within the muscle is going to be less compared to more an endurance-based athlete like a marathoner or an ultra marathoner, or even a cyclist, where it's going to be also stored in the muscles. The types of fats we consume. So we've got saturated fats, which are animal and vegetable oils, or animal products and vegetable oils. We also got monounsaturated, which is like olive and canola oils, also avocados and some nuts as well. We got polyunsaturated nuts and polyunsaturated fats, so include nuts and oily fish. We also got cholesterol as well, which is eggs we're specifically talking about. And then we got trans fats, and trans fats are actually these were introduced quite recently within the human evolution or human history. And they're actually probably the most dangerous fats than anything else. So when we consume a large amount of trans fats, it actually increases our fat storage within our body. So a lot of manufactured foods, we're talking about like packet chips, packet biscuits, tend to use trans fats as their main source of fat in the actual in their process. And these types of fats need to be highly avoided, or should be avoided in general. If you eat anything manufactured or anything that comes in a packet, more than likely you'll have some traces of trans fats. And margarine is a classic example of trans fats. And what happens when we lose fat? And this is what people kind of don't understand, what happens to the whole process of, burning calories and all that jazz. And this kind of refers back to the slide that I said, fats are actually made up of hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon. And you simply breathe it out as CO2 and water. So basically what happens is the body goes through a number of chemical reactions in order to get from the fat source to be be transported into the muscle cells, which is therefore transfers into the mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell. Therefore, then it can actually be utilized as energy. Then what are the byproducts of that as well is water and CO2. So the triglyceride gets broken down into a fatty acid. Then it gets transported into the mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell, which therefore we use, then it generates energy. Then we've got the byproducts of water and CO2. So simply we just kind of sweat it and breathe it out. It's pretty simple at the end of the day. In terms of what actually happens as well, this glycerol product here goes through a separate process to the actual fatty acids themselves. So we store it specifically, the fat. So if we're trying to mobilize fat from our tissue, so from our adipose tissue, it gets transported as a triglyceride, then it gets broken down within the cell to a fatty acid, then it gets transported, then utilized as for energy. So does fat make you fat? Simply put, no. Unless if you consume a diet high in carbs and fat with little protein and over what your body's energy requirements are, then yes. So what I'm really saying is, if you go on a diet where it's heavily restrictive, you feel like you're putting on weight, it's probably not the actual reason why you're actually putting on weight at the end of the day. But if you are consuming a diet where it's well above what your body requires on a daily basis, and you consistently do that day in, day out for a couple of weeks or a couple of months, don't be surprised that you are going to start putting on some body weight as a result. And depends on the physical activity that you're doing at the same time is going to be the determinant whether it is you are going to put on some muscle mass, or whether it's muscle and fat, or whether it's just primarily going to be fat mass, and you might actually drop some muscle mass at the same time as well, depending on your physical activity. But as I said before, it is a necessary part of our diet. So many systems within our body actually do rely on fat utilization of dietary fat for us to function appropriately. Well, that's pretty much it. Nice and short and straight to the point. We'll go, Mum. What are your thoughts?
Nothing much in particular. It's just that it's important in your diet, and it's interesting that what you said something. What was it you said about the sprinters before about fat?
Yeah, so sprinters, if they are going to store any fat, they're going to be storing it in the adipose tissue. So it's basically the subcutaneous fat, so between the skin and the muscle. That's where they're going to store their fat if they're doing a lot of like high intensity training, like interval based training. Whilst if we're looking at endurance athletes, if you cut their muscle in half, their thigh muscle in half, they're actually going to have pockets of fat cells within that, so they can actually utilize it during their exercise, because it's a high density fuel source. So it's kind of like diesel and 91 fuel. Diesel is something that it has a greater energy, it's greater concentration of energy compared to 91 fuel, which is still got energy, but it's per molecule, you're going to get more out of diesel, so therefore you can get more out of fat for that type of exercise.
Okay. Yeah.
Nathan.
I think I missed a little bit because I was having some dinner. I missed out on the part where you were differentiating the different fats. If you can go to that slide quickly, like your saturated. Okay. Do you have any sort of what do you think in regards to like what's better for you and what's, I guess, not so good for you in regards to the different type of fats?
This is always the argument that keeps changing, to be honest.
Yeah.
My point of view is trans fats, avoid them at all costs because they
Mhm.
actually increase fat storage, the amount of fat cells
Mm.
we have. So that's always something that I avoid in my diet, so anything that's highly refined, any chips or anything like that, crisps. In terms of cholesterol, eggs were demonized. I think it was the early 2000s. They were really demonized because cholesterol increases cholesterol in your bloodstream. So they basically said you get atherosclerosis, hardening of the cell walls. But we know now that carbohydrates and having a high carb diet as well, that includes high level of fat, actually in conjunction with those two is actually going to cause atherosclerosis. It's more so to do with the high carb diet as in conjunction with the fats as well. But if you go low carb, no carb, then you actually get positive outcomes as such. But it's I guess when it comes to the fats as well, I tend to focus more on saturated fats, and the reason why I focus on the saturated fats is because they were actually heavily demonized as being these dangerous fats, but saturated fats are the ones that get converted into your estrogen and your testosterone.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's just cool. Yeah, awesome. No, I think, like you said, I think with most things, it's in moderation. You don't want to have excess of too much of fat or any food if in that matter. But yeah, that makes sense. And I think fat as well it's good. Like I think you were saying earlier that it provides a lot of energy. And I think people forget that. It's like, low fat diets. I think you mentioned it as like it's if you go on that, you're actually going to get more hungry if you're in a low fat diet. Fats keep you going for longer, and I think that was a good point to point out. We shouldn't cut fat out because it's really good, not only for your health, but it's good for you just to sustain you for the day. So I like that as well.
And I like it particularly because those who are diabetics, usually it's very high carb, very low fat, very low protein, and they're trying to consume more fiber to kind of regulate their blood sugar levels as well, or make them feel fuller as well. But by including, by reducing carbohydrates, increasing fat, and increasing protein, you actually begin to start to control blood sugar levels.
Exactly. It's interesting.
So it can't be neglected.
No.
Dave.
Yeah, no, I think this is a good video to show someone who has my video on. Yeah, it's all good. Yeah. I think it's a good video to show someone who has been conditioned with that idea, oh, fat's bad, or I can't have this because it's high fat and stuff like that. And it's purely context driven based on what their needs are, really. I think as well, it depends on the sport. That everyone says like, oh, you need to have a high fat, like high carb diet, a low fat diet. I think it really depends on the person and their needs as well, and what sport they're doing. For someone who has a moderate intensity sport, and he knows where their anaerobic threshold is, I think getting them to have a really high fat diet could be helpful, because we know that the metabolizing fat happens within those lower heart rate levels as well. And I think I read some research is that the more fat you consume in those sort of sports, so like cycling, marathon running, that type of thing that you said before, the greater propensity of the fat being actually metabolized from adipose tissue and intramuscular triglycerides, and it spares muscle glycogen, and so they can tap into the muscle glycogen when they need to. So I think it's cool as well. And so I've seen the ones, so the same sort of studies, is that you have a person eating a high carbohydrate diet, does a marathon, and their performance actually suffers. And so, yeah, I think it's interesting to see what ratios you can have for different sporting needs and for different health rates as well. So, yeah, fat is definitely important.
Yeah, I think a good point is the diet needs to match the intensity and the volume of what you do. So say if you are a sprinter, you know, you're going to rely on carbohydrates because it's very intermittent in nature. So you need to be able to recover a lot faster. And unfortunately, fat is broken down at a slower rate. But also the climate can also dictate as well. But I definitely believe, you know, the intensity of what you're doing, also the duration, will ultimately dictate what your diet should be influenced or should be at the end of the day.
Definitely, yeah. I think some really important hormones have derivatives of fat in them. So without having an intake of fat, dietary fat, you're not getting good production of those essential hormones we need in the body. So it can cause an imbalance in them, and yeah, you lose hair growth, nail growth, stress, things like that. So yeah, really important.
Cool. Karen.
Am I here?
You are
I'm
here.
on my phone. Oh yes, I'm here. Well, here we go. That was really, really good. And I bet you learnt a lot about that, doing that, Trent. That was really a nuts and bolts thing in a really, really good short presentation that just said so much. It was amazing. I don't have a lot to really add to it, other than there's fats you eat and fat you store in your body, or fat that's in your body. Two totally different things, but first of all, I suppose the fats that you eat, yes, you went through all the different types of fat. The worst are trans fatty acids. The reason why it's like glycogen, the more refined you get, the more links in that chain that you mentioned have to be broken down, which means the body has to do that. And when the body has to do that, it has to repair, and there's more chance of causing dysfunction in the body, we call it. So more problems with causes of cancer and causes of autoimmune disease, that type of thing. Trans fats are not good. And trans fats are caused because of high heat with particular fats. So as far as your vegetable oils, your saturated fats, olive oil, pure olive oil is fine, not your extra virgin olive oil. They can all go to smoking level, we call it, is the level that can be a high heat and you don't get a trans fat, so you don't get those extra links added on. If you use low heat oils like an extra virgin olive oil, then you can get extra links in, and they're called trans fatty acids, and then that's not good. And yes, they're in all of those things that normally kill the jungles that our orangutans live in, which aren't good to start with as well. Trans fats, not good. All others, yeah, extra virgin olive oil, fantastic to eat. If you had to choose a high burning oil, you'd probably choose a canola over anything else. Or if you really wanted to do, you know, wok frying, you'd choose a peanut oil, which is a really high smoke value, and it's great to reduce that risk of trans fatty acids being formed. As far as eating fat goes, of course, there is also the problem of it building up within your arteries and causing problems like heart disease, that sort of thing. So it has to be in moderation, like everything that you do. But you shouldn't cut it out. As you say, it is needed to build up your fat tissue, your adipose tissue in your body, which stores glycogen. All of the carbohydrate that you eat, your liver turns it into glycogen, and then the glycogen is stored in adipose tissue. the marathon runners who, you know, don't have too much adipose tissue, they constantly have to put sugar and carbs into their mouth to get that instant energy. Whereas, you know, people like us, Lorraine, we've got a little bit of, you know, healthy adipose tissue that if we do anything extra, we're going to have that extra glycogen store to keep our energy up so that we don't get exhausted. And also, yes, it is so important with testosterone and female hormone estrogen. However, with the estrogen, more importantly, when you're going through menopause or even perimenopausal, because your estrogen stops in your ovaries and your adrenal glands, and your adipose tissue is where the estrogen is made. So we start getting hair thinning, lots of symptoms with the losing estrogen. But if we have that little bit of fat and adipose tissue, yes, around our stomach, probably around our thighs as well, that's healthy, really healthy. You don't want to be too thin when you're going through menopause at all. It's that's really important. And that's all I have to say. Another one of my favourite topics. I love it. I just can't stand it when people